Welcome everyone to the first in our series of 3 lectures on public education and race, the African American experience with Dr. Jarvis Givens. And as I said, we're recording this event with Dr. Givens's permission, and everyone is going to be muted and videos off except the speakers. So for those who don't know me, I'm Lisa Geisbond, Executive Director of Citizens for Public Schools, a statewide public education advocacy organization. And I couldn't be more excited about tonight's speaker and our series. CPS board member Barbara Fields will introduce our guest in a moment, but first I just want to quickly tell you a little bit about CPS if you don't know. CPS was founded in 1982 to defeat a ballot question that would have allowed public education funds to go to private and religious schools, and we did win that battle. So adequate and equitable school funding remains a key part of our mission to fight for education justice. We also fight to remove barriers to education opportunity, such as discriminatory admissions requirements, for example, to state vocational education and other schools. We have long advocated for better ways to assess student learning and school quality. So, for example, we work to cancel the high stakes MCAS system and develop a better system of assessment and accountability going forward. CPS was part of the coalition that defeated ballot question number 2 back in 2016. That would have lifted the cap on charter schools and allowed millions more dollars to be diverted from district schools. That coalition became known as the Massachusetts Education Justice Alliance. And as part of that coalition, CPS helped get the Student Opportunity Act passed to update the outdated state school funding formula and make it more equitable. I invite you to visit citizensforpublicschools.org and sign up for our e-newsletter to stay informed about our campaigns and how you can participate. Thanks to everyone who decided to become a member while registering for tonight. And if you haven't joined us yet and want to do so, you can do so via the website. I also invite you to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And in closing, I want to share a quote from an Atlantic magazine article by Dr. Givens, one that I emailed earlier today. The developmental needs of children, especially Black children, required a fierce social analysis of power in the world around them, and also exposure to the kind of beauty, justice, and right relationships they might enact upon the world, unquote. And I love this perspective on what children need, and I agree with it. But I also love it because I think it applies to CPS's work for racial and educational justice, which also requires a fierce social analysis of power and an appreciation of beauty, justice, and right relationships that we are working to enact upon the world together. And with that, I would love to turn it over to my friend, Barbara Fields.
Good evening, everyone. It is indeed a pleasure and an honor to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Jarvis Givens. I recently read his book, Fugitive Pedagogy, Carter G. Woodson and the Art of Black Teaching, and I just couldn't put it down. It's an historical work of art, truly informative, inspiring, and quite thought-provoking. But let me tell you a little bit about the author. Dr. Jarvis R. Givens is an assistant professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education and a faculty affiliate in the Department of African and African American Studies at Harvard University. He specializes in the history of education, African American history, and theories of race and power in education. His first book, Fugitive Pedagogy, Carter G. Woodson and the Art of Black Teaching, was published this year by Harvard University Press, and he is currently building the Black Teacher Archive, an online portal which will house digitized records documenting the more than 100-year history of colored teacher associations. His emerging projects include a book analyzing relationships between Indigenous, white, and Black education in the United States through the 19th century, a biography of educational leader and civil rights activist Mary McLeod Bethune, and a project on Black social life in Compton, California, in the 1980s and 1990s, based on family and community archives. Gibbons' work explores themes of education, power, and resistance contextually, beyond rigid frames that limit where we look for meaningful experiences of teaching and learning. His work is committed to clarifying how persecution has impacted the lives of Black people and other oppressed communities in school and society, while also attending to how these communities have used education and culture subversively to seek out lives that transcend their sufferings. Professor Gibbons' research has been supported by fellowships and grants from the Ford Foundation, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, as well as the William F. Milton Fund. Professor Gibbons earned his PhD in African American Studies from the University of California, Berkeley. He is a native of Compton, California, and currently resides in Roxbury, Massachusetts. Before Dr. Gibbons begins, I'd just like to, I'm sorry, something came up on my screen here. I would just like to let you know that while he's presenting, I am sure you will have questions that you want to ask. You can use the chat to put those questions forward, and then at the end of the presentation, we will have the opportunity to have him respond to those questions. And that will be facilitated by Executive Director Lisa, from whom you just heard speak. And so with that, I am going to turn it over to Dr. Gibbons.
All right. Thank you for that very generous introduction, Barbara. I have to say, I sent a shorter version of my introduction, but I appreciate you for taking the time to include more of those details that you found fitting to kind of share with the audience today. But I also want to thank Barbara for the work that she's continued to do here in the local community in Boston, and for welcoming me into that community that she's a part of, and for inviting me to be with you all today. But also want to thank Lisa and the rest of the members of Citizens for Public Schools for inviting me to be with you all. I'm excited to share this presentation that I have for today, and looking forward to the questions that you'll ask during the Q&A portion. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about a lot of the kind of big ideas that are at the heart of the book that I just completed and that was just recently published by Harvard University Press. The title of the talk is The Fugitive Life of Black Teaching, which is in many ways kind of the history, the intellectual and social history that I trace in the book. So Fugitive Pedagogy, Carter G. Woodson and the Art of Black Teaching is really my attempt to offer a more balanced account of African-American education. And I understand this to be a history that requires the embrace of competing narratives, both a story of persecution, but also one of fierce resistance the entire time. While I was initially drawn to the subversive practices of Black education and Black teachers and their students in particular, I found the language of resistance, which tends to refer to the challenging of power, to be accurate but insufficient. Scholars often focus on Black people's struggle to gain access to education, desegregation through courts, and exceptional narratives of individual educational achievement. The everyday character of Black resistance, however, has largely gone unacknowledged. Thus, attending to these aspects of Black educational life in the 19th century up and through the Jim Crow period has required new and dynamic language. Fugitivity names more precisely the form that resistance takes in these contexts that I'm writing about. Fugitivity is covert, concealed, hidden, planning and intentional strategy. And what I call fugitive pedagogy consists of African Americans' physical and intellectual acts that explicitly challenged anti-Black protocols of educational domination. Actions that often took place in discreet or partially concealed fashion. And so to illuminate key aspects of fugitive pedagogy, I'd like to begin with the opening scenario from my book. Tessie McGee read to her class in a steady, measured tone, quietly engaging in a calculated act of subversion. She was Black, 28 years old, and she taught history at the Webster Parish Training School in 1933, the only Black secondary school in Webster Parish, Louisiana. The state's all-white Department of Education and the local school board gave very clear instructions. Teachers were to keep the pre-approved outline openly displayed on their desks, which they were to follow closely to ensure that their students became acquainted with the targeted learning objectives. Black educators and families in Webster Parish had little formal control over curriculum. Yet on many occasions, McGee made what she deemed to be necessary revisions to the mandatory curriculum. Based on her own judgment, and perhaps at the recommendation of fellow Black teachers, she often read passages from Carter G. Woodson's book on the Negro, which rested comfortably in her lap. She kept the textbook out of sight, understanding that if she were to be caught, she would be vulnerable to the disciplinary practices of Jim Crow authorities. But she was undeterred. Quote, "She read to us from that book," one of McGee's students recounted. And when the principal would come in, she would simply lift her eyes to the outline that resided on the desk and begin reading from the outline. When the principal disappeared, her eyes went back to the book in her lap, end quote. So for the remainder of my time this evening, I want to take, and look closely at three particular aspects of this scenario that I've just shared: the teacher, the textbook, and the student. I'll offer a closer reading of Ms. McGee's effort to escape the official curriculum by way of the hidden transcript, literally resting on her lap. How Woodson's textbook, The Negro in Our History, rendered a competing narrative of Black life that defied racist school policies and curricula. And then finally, I'll look at this student, Jerry Moore, who bore witness to McGee and her fugitive practice, leaving some record of it to be recovered and studied in the future. The teacher. Tessie McGee's method of instruction constitutes a textbook example of what I am calling fugitive pedagogy. Her concealed lesson plan rejected the degrading representations of Black life, and such refusal manifested in physical form. McGee's public display of the official outline was in fact a masked performance of complicity, an embodied text that accompanied the subversive and spoken content of her lesson. McGee's physical act of switching text also communicated important messages to her students, demonstrating how defiance could at times be disguised by public performances of deference to the coercive regime of school authorities. And teachers like Tessie McGee gained access to these alternative scripts of knowledge through what the sociologist Alden Morris has called insurgent intellectual networks. And these were associations like Carter G. Woodson's Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, but also the organizations of Black teachers and their professional organizations. Such groups comprised a veiled yet networked Black educational world, one where African Americans said one thing, but did another. Given rampant anti-Black violence, the true political intentions undergirding Black educational strivings were rarely on full display. African Americans responded, often in quiet, calculated acts of resistance against an oppressive school setting that reflected a world order built on Black subjection. Fugitive pedagogy was a collective endeavor, even when manifesting as these individual acts of practice, like the example that I just shared. For example, the principal entering McGee's classroom was a Black man named J.L. Jones. And record suggests that Principal Jones supported the inclusion of Black history and culture at Webster Parish. He was a leading member in the Louisiana Colored Teachers Association, which had explicitly endorsed Carter G. Woodson and his work. And Woodson regularly attended and showed up on the programs at annual meetings of Black teacher associations at both the state and national level. And what you see on the screen is Carter G. Woodson's life membership certificate in the National Black Educators Association. But also to the right of the screen is one of many newspaper clippings where we see Carter G. Woodson showing up at these annual meetings of Black teachers at the state level. This example is from Tennessee, but there are plenty of examples of Woodson at the Louisiana Colored Teachers Association and across various different states in the country as well. So given what we see here and what we know about Woodson's affiliation with these organizations and the principal's active participation in supporting Woodson's work in the Louisiana Colored Teachers Association, it's not implausible then to consider that Principal Jones and Miss McGee may have very likely conspired together. The principal testing the teacher to ensure she could protect herself and the school if a white official entered the classroom. Wearing the mask, as the poet Paul Laurence Dunbar called it, had long been part and parcel of Black teachers' professional disposition. In Black segregated schools, the intrusion of white surveillance had a hand in shaping the school ecology. It was not atypical for white people to drop by unannounced during the school day, either to show off what they referred to as our Negro schools to visitors or for some other routine inspection. Such visits were primarily meant to demonstrate power, which was essential to reproducing domination. So this is to say, the person entering McGee's classroom could just as easily have been a white school official. Black educators walked a tightrope when challenging such oppressive school settings, because if they were to fall or be caught, there was no safety net to catch them. In fact, just a few years prior, the white school board in Muskogee, Oklahoma, which was heavily influenced by the Ku Klux Klan, I should say, had learned that Carter G. Woodson's textbooks were being used in the local Black high school. The books were confiscated, teachers at the school were reprimanded, and the principal was threatened and forced to resign. And then after reading the textbooks, the school board, quote, expressed horror and surprise that such a work should have crept into our Negro schools, end quote. They assured their white constituents that they will be more vigilant moving forward, stating, quote, we must not take in teachers who will create discord by teaching isms of any sort, end quote. And examples of this kind of violent oversight are plentiful, and they move forward and backwards in time as far as Black teachers are concerned. Black teachers were routinely targeted and fired for challenging white authority. And some notable examples of this is Ida B. Wells in Memphis, Tennessee in the 1890s, John W. Davison being fired in Georgia in the early 20th century, Anna Julia Cooper in Washington, D.C., and of course, the iconic case of Septima Clark in South Carolina. And yet, there were Black teachers who lost more than their jobs. Harry and Harriet Moore were fired in 1946 and later killed when their home was bombed in Mims, Florida. Black teachers' awareness of such stories prompted them, at times, to conceal their pedagogical objectives in the presence of intrusive white power. Subjection to surveillance and violence, motivated by no causal logic whatsoever, was a fact of Blackness. African-American educators developed strategies to contest this reality, which ranged from broad institutional realms down to the interpersonal and psychic levels. Fugitivity, in its historical reference, holds in place both the realities of constraint and Black Americans straining against said confinement. It is careful not to overstate one or the other. And as the poet Fred Moten aptly notes, and I paraphrase here, escape is an activity, it's not an achievement. The possible threat of recapture always lingered. Escape was unresolved and uncertain, and Black teachers carried intimate knowledge of such precarity. The textbook. So my concern with the historical framings of Black education actually began with the textbook. I had come across a passing reference to one of Carter G. Woodson's textbooks, which you see pictured on the screen being read by a group of junior high students in the 1930s in New Orleans. I was aware that Carter G. Woodson played a central role in African-American studies as the second Black person to receive a PhD from Harvard in 1912, and as the founder of Negro History Week in 1926, which of course we now celebrate today as Black History Month. But I was shocked to learn about the size of his impact in Black teachers' classrooms, in the private spaces of Black teachers' classrooms, I should be clear. While most accounts emphasize Woodson's role as a historian, and you might have heard him referred to as the father of Black history, much less has been written about Woodson's 30-year career as a public school teacher. But the wide circulation of his ideas and curriculum materials among Black teachers implied for me a much more complicated story than those suggested by the pervasive images of dilapidated school buildings that we've all seen when we've seen the history of Black education prior to Brown reflected in images and in film, right? This story of Carter G. Woodson and these textbooks and this intellectual histories of Black teachers complicated that narrative, right? Suggesting that the aggressive neglect of Black education that tends to dominate public memory and academic scholarship is only part of the story. And what intrigued me most about Woodson's textbooks, as well as those written by Black public school teachers before him, was their extensive commemoration of fugitive slaves and Black fugitive life. As early as 1890, Black educators wrote textbooks that were filled with heroic narratives about Black enslaved people who absconded from plantations, those who led slave revolts, stories of maroon communities in the dismal swamps of Virginia, Suriname, Brazil, and Jamaica. And that's not all. The fugitive slave emerged as a folk hero and cultural symbol in the curriculum developed by these educators. The fugitive slave also appeared in school naming practices and within commemorative ceremonies in school activities and rituals. And it was this realization that prompted my reliance on the fugitive slave archetype and on fugitive pedagogy as a theory and practice of Black educational life in the United States. What I'm saying here is that this term that I'm offering is much, much more than just an elaborate metaphor. It indexes the embodied and intellectual acts of subversion that were central to Black educational strivings. And it's about a phenomenon that surfaced in the archive at multiple levels. And what's more, the concept draws a narrative line from those enslaved people and their defiance of anti-literacy laws, which rendered Black education and criminality equal transgressions. This framework links those experiences and that history to the work of teachers like Tessie McGee and their subversive practices in the Jim Crow period, right? So that this conceptual framework is offering a different way of narrating and thinking about the history of Black educational politics. And it was clarifying to learn that the first Black textbooks were written by fugitive slaves. James W.C. Pennington, an escaped slave from Maryland, inaugurated this tradition in 1841. A textbook on the origins and history of the colored people represents the beginning of a formalized practice of Black people striving to rewrite the system of knowledge. The fugitive slave William Wells Brown also wrote a textbook in 1863. So as the 19th century witnessed the proliferation of Black newspapers, journals, and various other forms of Black print culture, textbooks also became tools, not only of the master, but also of the fugitive slave. Such counter readings of the world carried over to Woodson's theorizing about Black education. For instance, in his iconic text, The Miseducation of the Negro, Woodson wrote, quote, "Starting out after the Civil War, the opponents of freedom and social justice decided that they would work out a program which would enslave the Negro's mind in as much as the freedom of body had to be conceded," end quote. He suggested that the political conflicts at the very core of Black education were fundamentally linked to the legacies and social technologies of enslavement. And in his very first textbook, The Negro in Our History, Woodson offered the following, quote, How some of these slaves learned in spite of opposition makes a beautiful story. Knowing the value of learning as a means of escape and having longing for it too because it was forbidden, many slaves continued their education under adverse circumstances, end quote. So here we see Woodson naming this entanglement of violent white opposition and the enslaved people's steady practice of learning as a means of escape, offering it as a generative lesson for students and educators during the Jim Crow period. Because indeed, this was the origin story that framed what was politically at stake in their teaching and learning. This dialectic was the heritage of Black education. At its highest calling, Black education continued to be a stealing away from and refusal of the American school common protocols and curricula. And so now let us consider the Louisiana textbook. That was the formal adopted curriculum that Tessie McGee would have been required to teach from. According to records from the Louisiana's Department of Education, there were 2 textbooks that the states adopted for secondary instruction. Modern Times in the Living Past by a historian named Henry Elson, and an American History by Nathaniel Wright Stevenson. Both render distorted images of Black life, and I'm not going to get into very deep detail about these texts, but suffice it to say that they both render distorted images of Black life, but I'll offer just one brief example from the 10th grade textbook to share with you what I mean by this. In the first chapter of Modern Times, Elson wrote the following: "Not only are almost all the civilized nations of today of the white race, but throughout all the historic ages, this race has taken the lead and has been foremost in the world's progress." He then goes on to explain that, quote, "Almost the entire book will be devoted to the doings of the Caucasian race, or more specifically, at least 9/10 of the book must be given to an account of the Indo-European branch of the race, as the Indo-Europeans have dominated the world for the past 2,500 years, end quote. So based on Louisiana's adopted curriculum, Tessie McGee and her students were narratively condemned to borrow from Black studies scholar Sylvia Wynter. It deemed them to be of no human concern. So while we are unaware of the exact passage Tessie McGee might have been reading from Carter G. Woodson's textbook, we at least know what she was negating. And the historical record makes clear that Woodson worked fervently from his office at 1538 9th Street Northwest in the historic Shaw District of Washington, D.C. Woodson lived, worked, and died in this building. It was from this post that he responded personally to letters written to him by individual teachers. Some wrote him with historical questions. Others inquired in hushed tones about how they might strategically work to challenge curriculum standards on a local level. Woodson and his very small staff mailed textbooks to individual teachers in schools across the country. They packaged Negro history kits by hand and shipped off decorative materials for teachers to refashion their classrooms. And interestingly enough, it's during the Depression years that Woodson's educational program expanded most dramatically. After developing a very unfavorable reputation among white philanthropists by the 1930s, Woodson came to rely on the Black masses to support his Association for the Study of Negro Life and History. And I should say that this relationship between Woodson and white philanthropy is very important to this narrative, both for Woodson, but also this early history of Black education in general. So if there's an opportunity to talk about that more during the Q&A, by all means, ask a question about it. But I want to say that in Woodson's reliance on the Black masses to continue to sustain his organizations through the 1930s, it was Black teachers who were at the forefront of this cause. And this included Black educators beyond the South as well. Though small in number, African-American educators in northern states also challenged distortions of Black life in curricula. Wilhelmina Crossan of Boston was one of these teachers in the North. Crossan arranged for Woodson to meet with local Black students whenever he visited the city, she said. "I can see him now," she wrote, quote, seated in the Victorian chair in the Baldwin Memorial Library of the League of Women, saying to this group of youngsters, "If you do not learn about the history of your race, you will become a negligible factor in the thought of the world. Be proud of your race, be proud of who you are," end quote. Crossan and her brother would be the ones to introduce Negro History Week to their local community in Roxbury, starting in its inaugural year of 1926. Crossan served on the editorial board for Woodson's magazine for teachers and students, the Negro History Bulletin, and she conducted field research for Woodson's ASNLH, and she would go on to convince him that it was possible to host an annual convening of his association in Boston in 1944, despite Woodson's concerns that hosting the conference so far away from the southern states would impact attendance. But Woodson would go on to publicly recognize the work of teachers like Crossan for sustaining the association. He described how, quote, "Miss Crossan appealed to her friends to rally as a committee to sponsor this annual meeting. She sought no honor or any other consideration for herself, and the citizens, especially the women, rallied to the call," end quote. Because of Crossan's effective organizing with the local host committee, Woodson observed, quote, that they had secured about 200 members whom they have organized as the Boston branch of the association, end quote. Woodson charged that the reconstitution of knowledge was a critical step in challenging the violent assault against Black humanity. He professed, quote, "There would be no lynching if it did not start in the schoolroom." Woodson often named this schoolroom lynching duality because it highlighted what was fundamentally at stake. Education was not just about vocational trades, developing more Black professionals, or bourgeois performances of citizenship. It was about insisting on Black social and political life as opposed to death. It meant making legible the social disfiguring of Black humanity that whiteness demands for its propping up, and refusing it through counter readings of both the word and world. Pending radical reformation of the American school, Woodson urged educators to perform bold acts of defiance. And so now the student. Black students were always watching. To elevate the significance of Tessie McGee's fugitive pedagogy, I want to invert the scenario and call your attention to the student as witness. The 16-year-old Jerry Moore, who took note of Miss McGee as she removed her mask of compliance when it was safe to do so. How, as he put it, quote, "her eyes went back to the book in her lap." In recounting this one gesture by his teacher, Jerry Moore revealed how what was seen, heard, and felt in Black classrooms all affected what students learned. Education extended far beyond what was uttered or written. They learned from the value systems that shape school routines and the actions of their teachers. All the while, Black students were watching them, witnessing. And I should say that these first-person accounts by Black students have become central to my thinking about Black teachers and the politics of African-American education. Their chorus of voices expand the historical record in very critical ways, providing some of the most reliable sources of what Black teachers actually did beyond the watchful eye of white paternalism and surveillance. Angela Davis is a key example of this. Born in Birmingham, Alabama in 1944, the scholar and activist recalled how, quote, "Carter G. Woodson's Negro History Week was the highlight of our year," end quote. During these commemorative weeks, Davis's teachers instructed students to, quote, "slam shut and cast aside the books that did their best to persuade us that our ancestors were much better off during slavery than they would have been had they remained in Africa," end quote. Davis and her schoolmates were allowed, quote, "to rely on our own ability to produce knowledge about the conditions surrounding our lives," end quote. Students were invited to engage in a collective critique of the normative white curriculum in their casting it aside. More than a captive audience, Black students were active participants, dissident learners who were participating in the tradition of fugitive pedagogy. Davis recalled encountering a photo of Harriet Tubman. She stated nostalgically, quote, "I remember, I always visualized Harriet Tubman as my grandmother. I thought my grandmother bore this striking resemblance to her, and that still remains with me to this day, end quote. Tubman's picture inspired Davis not only because she shared some likeness with her grandmother, but also because of the scripts accompanying the image of this fugitive slave. According to Davis, her teachers emphasized how, quote, Harriet Tubman helped more slaves to gain their freedom than any other conductor on the Underground Railroad, end quote. And when writing about her student experiences in Birmingham, Davis also bore witness to the vulnerability of her teachers. She described the belittling actions of white visitors and school authorities, writing, quote, when these white assaults were staged, I tried to decipher the emotions on the teacher's face. Acquiescence, obsequiousness, defiance, or was it the pain of realizing that if she did decide to fight back, she would surely lose her job, end quote. But what I'm trying to say is that undergirding these experiences was a shared vulnerability between teachers and students in the context of Black education. And Davis gives language to this when she recalls the racialized violence in Birmingham during her childhood. She recalled the sounds of bombs exploding across the street from her home, as well as her mother having been the teacher of one of the young girls who was killed in the bombing of 16th Street Baptist Church. Such events reflected the perpetual threat that Black students, teachers, and communities had to reckon with, both in and outside of the classroom. The witnessing in Black classrooms was textured by this shared vulnerability of teachers and students, and therefore often required shared action. Jerry Moore recognized this in Miss McGee's classroom as her lesson plan switched with the turning of a doorknob. Angela Davis recounted the intellectual partnership between students and teachers as they engaged in a shared critique of the American curriculum. Such moments hinged on a fugitive reading practice of the known world. And this transcript of Black students bearing witness to fugitive pedagogy goes far and wide. In 1929, for example, a student at the National Training School for Women and Girls, which was the school of Nannie Helen Burroughs, the students would explain the following in her yearbook, quote, this school teaches history and Negro history, and the students are tremendously inspired by learning the truth about their race. Dr. Carter G. Woodson's books are used as a text here, and we have a room, a real library, if you please, set apart for the study of Negro life and history, end quote. And then a few pages later in the textbooks, the training school students celebrated one of their peers, a student named Catherine Allen, whom these students referred to as a race agitator. In fact, quote, many race agitators have been discovered, and Miss Allen, a senior, is sure to become another Sojourner Truth, end quote. So we see these students celebrating the young activists in the making, and again, the fugitive slave reappears as a folk hero, Sojourner Truth having been featured as her own superlative category. The Congressman John Lewis offered a similar narrative when recalling, quote, the unbelievable teachers in Troy, Alabama, end quote. Lewis went on to explain, when I was a little child growing up in rural Alabama, just a short walk from the cotton fields, my teachers would often have us cut out photographs and pictures of great African Americans for Carter G. Woodson's Negro History Week, end quote. Lewis also emphasized that it was these same teachers who discreetly told students stories about the civil rights protests and boycotts taking place in cities like Montgomery, even when they couldn't speak openly about it in the context of their classrooms. So for students like Angela Davis, the training school girls, and John Lewis, their teachers' fugitive pedagogy allowed them to situate themselves in a continuum of consciousness. They were taught to aspire to be part of a tradition of Black people who disrupted an anti-Black social order. And I'll share this last student example because it's one of my favorites that I came across when I was writing the book. And this is from the historian John Bracy, who recalled Negro History Week at Mott Elementary during the 1940s. So against the backdrop of Jim Crow, Bracy recalled how his teachers called upon students to literally embody the story of revolt by staging a reenactment of the Haitian Revolution. He states, I always wanted to be Toussaint Louverture. He got to wear the hat and carry the sword and sit in the chair, right? You're on stage. You've got to think, I'm in elementary school. You're on stage and you have Toussaint with the big hat and the sword, and then you have the other people. We had to be the soldiers who marched around and changed clothes to trick the French. That meant we went off stage and you had to put on another shirt and then came back. I wanted to be Toussaint. I thought he was the baddest dude in the world anyway. We were taught that he was the greatest military leader the world had ever seen. Don't worry about all those other people. George Washington, no. Toussaint Louverture. Why? Because he freed Haiti. He ended slavery. He defeated all the Europeans that attacked him. He was the baddest dude in the world, and we knew that. So the Black student body itself was a site of learning. Through dramatizations, pageants, rituals, and class assignments, students became bodies in descent, to borrow from the performance theorist Daphne Brooks. Angela Davis's recognition of her grandmother's likeness to the image of Harriet Tubman had key implications for her own raced and gendered body. And perhaps the lesson became most clear when the student body became Toussaint Louverture, when there was an embodied recognition between Tubman and the student's grandmother. Black learners became fugitive pedagogy enfleshed, at times literally enacting narratives of Black fugitive life. They're putting on different colored clothes as they marched on and off stage to trick the French. The form and function of such performance was not unrelated to Tessie McGee's covert use of Woodson's textbook in the Jim Crow classroom. The very textbook documenting this history of Black people learning as a means of escape, end quote. These scenarios scattered across time and place were not sporadic, unplanned events or mere infrapolitics. They reflect coordinated efforts on the part of Black educators. Fugitive pedagogy in the classroom was a dress rehearsal. Students' participation in the subversive politics of Black education anticipated and prefigured their active involvement in the civil rights struggles and Black power movement on the horizon, not to mention their demands for Black studies in the American university. Resistance was omnipresent in Black segregated classrooms. Contrary to popular assumptions, Black educators promoted that resistance in the minds of their students, and it built up over time and culminated in the modern freedom struggle. Their pedagogy was like a river, and it moved through the lives of their students. It ebbed and flowed, took unexpected turns, but always continued in the direction of a new world. So the Black teachers and students called upon in my book are portals into a heritage of fugitive pedagogy. And I hope to have told their stories in a way that moves beyond mere description and narratives of heroic struggle. Instead, having teased out insights about the deeper meaning of education in Black people's struggle for human goodness and flourishing, for a new world to be and new ways to be in the world. And as Toni Morrison showed through her fictional character Sixo, a language is only worth speaking or writing or singing if you can see a future in it. I look to Black teachers of the past whose fugitive acts can teach us so much about the future. They represent a tradition that has been plundered from today's Black educators who are its rightful inheritors. And yet, all who are committed to critical pedagogy or to anti-racist teaching, as the term has become popularized, those educators might also draw inspiration from their legacy. I see the cast of characters in my book as standard bearers, a tradition passed through these teachers and their students, and their heritage is one worthy of both praise and deep study. And so I'd like to end there and transition to the conversation portion of tonight's event. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen, but I want to invite Barbara, who's going to join me in conversation, and perhaps maybe ask any questions that might have come up for you during the presentation. But we also want to invite questions from the audience as well for the remainder of the time.
What an inspirational, and it's just almost impossible to define the feeling that I have after hearing you share your research with us, as well as having, as I said before, just finished reading the book. So I would encourage anyone who's listening to pick up the book and to read it if you haven't read it already. And particularly if you're a Black teacher. If you're a Black teacher, to know that history and the role that Black teacher associations have played will help us, I think, to continue the struggle that's still here and to be advised by the readings and your research on how we can stay encouraged and motivated to continue the work, along with our allies and those who are interested in the same kind of work. So I'd like to ask the first question, and then I'm going to turn it over to Lisa, who's going to go to the chat and to read those questions for you. And so my question would be, as you reflect back on your research on Dr. Woodson and the art of Black teaching, what advice do you offer us in our resistance, still the current resistance, to the status quo of racism and white supremacy in our schools, and particularly in our curriculum?
Thanks for that question. One of the things that come to mind that I always think is important to lift up is that something that I was very fascinated by, and I felt like I had to really grapple with this early on, is when I started digging in the archive and studying about these teachers, Carter G. Woodson himself, and also having to just reframe how I thought about Woodson as not just a PhD, Harvard-trained historian, but to actually think about him and all this work that he was doing as a school teacher. It forced me to realize the kind of the rich intellectual culture that was a part of the identity of these teachers and the world that they created. So these were not teachers who were only concerned about the procedural aspects of teaching and the kind of transactional aspects of what's going on in the classroom, but we find them in their papers and in their lives wrestling with deep conceptual and intellectual questions about what the larger purpose of education was in their lives. You know, Carter G. Woodson, one of the first generation in his family to be born on the other side of slavery, right? So we see these educators as not just practitioners, right? But they're scholars of the practice. They're teachers who are engaging in intellectual struggle and who understood their work and their practice to be, something that required them to engage in deep intellectual questions in order to think about what it was that they were actually doing and trying to engage in racial uplift and social transformation through their pedagogy in the classroom. That required them to reach outside of what was offered to them by local school boards and school districts, and also required them to reach outside of traditional teacher training pathways, right? Carter G. Woodson raised questions and critiqued and indicted, dominant teacher training pathways because he said it was woefully insufficient to meet the needs of, Black teachers who were trying to address the concerns of Black students, because not only did the curriculum not take into account the lived and material realities of Black people, but also the kind of theories and the practice and the theories that were informing the practice that they were being trained in was not accounting for the realities of Black life. And so that intellectual work is something that we always have to remind teachers of, is that even as a lot of the training that teachers go through emphasizes, the practical transactional aspect of what it means to be a teacher, I think that Woodson in this history invites us to think more expansively about the intellectual side of what happens in the classroom, right? And for teachers to challenge that's part of the deprofessionalization of teachers in general, right? Is forcing teachers to just adhere to the scripts that they're offered and what they're supposed to do in the classroom, stripping them of the kind of intellectual agencies that should also always be a part of anyone's pedagogy if they're in fact coming to kind of engage students in the process of thinking about knowledge and reflecting on knowledge and thinking about its relationship to the world that they find themselves in, right? I think of James Baldwin when I think about this particular point. There's an exchange between James Baldwin and Nikki Giovanni when Nikki Giovanni says, the artist is free to do, whatever they want to do, but everyone doesn't have that ability. And she goes on to say, for teachers, for instance, teachers don't have the ability to teach, what they understand to be important, because they're bound by the procedural kind of mandates of, standards, so on and so forth. And then James Baldwin stops Nikki Giovanni and says, a teacher who is not free to teach what they know to be is true, right, is no teacher at all. And obviously there are some things that we have to account for there, but I think generally that critique is something that's very, very important to hold up and to call attention to, is that educators have to understand the difference between just being a practitioner versus being scholars of the practice, right? Teachers like Woodson and these Black educators that I'm writing about understood that they had to engage in intellectual struggle because they were at odds and they were warring not just with racist school policies and the disproportionate allocation of resources, but they're saying they're actually at war with the actual substance and content of education as well, that actually structured and informed and legitimized the kind of aggressive neglect that Black people experience in the material world, whether that be in terms of lynching and mob violence, but also the disproportionate allocation of resources and the lack of resources that they received in schools. That though there's a relationship between those intellectual concerns and the material concerns in the world, right? That's what Woodson offers us. And I think that we always have to return to and think about in response to that question that you asked.
Thank you. And I know others in the chat have questions, so I'm gonna let Lisa take it from here to talk about what's in the chat. Lisa?
Yeah. Thank you, Barbara. And thank you, Jarvis, so much that there's so much to chew on and think about, and really such a treasure to have you with us. I appreciate you taking the time and putting together such a thoughtful presentation. And I'm sure we have some great questions in the chat that I'm going to try and get through, but I just want to thank you for being with us and expanding our minds this way. And also encourage everyone, this was like a little appetizer of what I'm sure can be found in the whole book. And I put the link in the chat to purchase a book from Frugal Bookstore. So I encourage everybody to do that. So to the questions, Danny Martin asked or said that he would love to hear more about how Woodson influenced and was influenced by other fugitive educators of the day, including Nannie Helen Burroughs, Anna Julia Cooper, and Fanny Jackson Coppin.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Well, one of the things that I'll say is that, Carter G. Woodson was a teacher at the M Street School in Washington, D.C., which was arguably the most prestigious Black high school in the country. And it's important for us to keep in mind is that, Woodson becomes a teacher in Washington, D.C. at the end of the first decade of the 20th century. So in 1909, when he goes to work in Washington, D.C., having worked in various other places before he gets there. But when he gets to the M Street School, even while he's pursuing his PhD, there are other faculty members that also are very kind of accomplished educators. Anna Julia Cooper was one of them. Anna Julia Cooper was a Latin teacher at the M Street School, but she had previously written her book, A Voice from the South by a Black woman from the South, right, which is a very important early text, but had also been the principal of that high school, but was fired because of a lot of the tensions that she had with the local kind of school officials. I'm sure her inviting people like W.E.B. Du Bois to come and talk to the students at the M Street School did not make her a popular kind of education figure at a time when many of the white education officials in Washington, D.C. was trying to impose an industrial model of education on Black education, even in D.C. So what I'm trying to say is that Woodson was absolutely shaped by the intellectual work of people like Anna Julia Cooper by virtue of being a colleague of theirs, right? Even someone else like Jessie Fawcett, who was Du Bois's secretary when he was writing for The Crisis, was also a teacher at the M Street School in Washington, D.C. But Woodson had also been taught by Black educators. His first teachers were his formerly enslaved uncles. He attended the Frederick Douglass School in Huntington, West Virginia, and he saw his first cousin, who shared a name with him, his first cousin, Carter Barnett, who was fired as the principal because of his political advocacy through his self-published newspaper in Huntington, West Virginia, to run an independent slate of Black candidates for office. So Woodson saw many of these educators that were engaging not only in important work in the context of schools, but who were also active in the political work in the community surrounding these schools, from the time that he was a student himself to the time that he's a teacher in Washington, D.C., right? So Carter G. Woodson is the central figure in the book, right? Is the frame that I then use to look out into this much more expansive network where we see people like Nannie Helen Burroughs, who Carter G. Woodson helped raise money for her school, right? Or Nannie Helen Burroughs, who was a member of the organization that he created. But also people like Mary McLeod Bethune, who was also an educator and who was the president of Woodson's Association for the last 15 years of his life, who really helped him expand his mission in the world of Black teachers, because Mary McLeod Bethune was a former president of the National Association of Teachers in Colored Schools, right, which was the national group for Black teachers across the country, primarily in the South. But she was also the president of the Florida Colored Teachers Association just after the First World War in Florida. So we see his partnership with these various different Black educators in different places, people like Luther Porter Jackson, who was a very prominent educator at Virginia State in Virginia, who helped to expand and raise money for the organization among the Black teachers and students in Virginia, right? So there was these networks, right, and these organizations that had a shared political agenda, and where we see lots of overlap between members in one state or in one organization that are also in others. And we see these kind of intellectual exchanges happening by virtue of people being in the same school, but also in the same organizations.
Great, thank you. We have a question from Andrea Siggs. How much independence did white philanthropists allow Woodson in the development of materials? Was their support predicated upon the understanding that his pedagogy would remain within certain limits?
So this is a question that I didn't get to talk. I talk about this extensively in chapters 2 and 3 of the book, because it's a very important part of the narrative. And the story is that while Woodson is able to secure the support of white philanthropists in the first decade of building his organization, so this is the kind of, he starts the organization in 1915, and he really starts to get a lot of support from white philanthropists by the beginning of the 1920s. But he has kind of challenges with the white philanthropists, quite early on, actually. One in particular, Thomas Jesse Jones, who worked for the Phelps Stokes Fund as their director of education research and activities. And Thomas Jesse Jones was a sociologist by training, who was trained at Columbia, but had very particular ideas about using kind of philanthropy for social impact, and had very particular racial ideas as well, right? Thomas Jesse Jones was a white man working within this world of white philanthropists and a trusted advisor of all the major kind of white philanthropists. When we think about the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, et cetera, et cetera. So early on in the 1920s, Carter G. Woodson learns of Thomas Jesse Jones's effort to block Max Yergin from going back to South Africa for the YMCA, where he was working with Native kind of South Africans through the YMCA there, because of concerns about Black Americans stimulating or engaging in kind of political activity on the ground there. So there became a concern about Max Yergin. And so Thomas Jesse Jones blocked, him from getting approved to go back. Woodson learns of this and publicly criticizes Thomas Jesse Jones for doing this, right? This becomes a very early kind of, tension between him and white philanthropists. But by the end of the 1920s, he essentially becomes completely alienated by white philanthropists, because they say that Woodson is too controlling and is resistant to interracial cooperation. Whereas Woodson would say their version of interracial cooperation requires Black intellectuals to essentially do what they're told, right? And Woodson has to leave, Howard University as well for similar reasons, because the white president of Howard University is engaging in a lot of censorship of Black faculty, and Woodson is resistant to this, right? So this is why Woodson is only a professor at Howard University from 1919 until 1920. Is because he felt that his intellectual work was being constrained by the kind of censorship and restraints that were imposed by, white philanthropists, but also white leaders of Black educational institutions at the time. So then we get to a place like 1932, where the Phelps-Stokes Fund and Thomas Jesse Jones decided that they want to create an encyclopedia of the Negro. And they pull together a group of scholars and they say, but under one condition, W.E.B. Du Bois and Carter G. Woodson cannot participate, right? And many of the Black scholars that they assembled said, how can you ask for us to create a encyclopedia on the Negro? And the two most prominent Black historians, Du Bois and Woodson, are not able to participate in this, and they resist. And so then they extend an invitation to Du Bois and Woodson refuses because he says the terms of the invitation to begin with tells him everything that he needs to know about the intentions of the philanthropists, right? So essentially by the 1930s moving forward, Woodson doesn't receive any major funding from white philanthropists because of those consistent challenges that we see between him from the 1920s up until 1930, right? And those are just two examples. But then Woodson will go on and critique white philanthropists for their efforts to manipulate and control the development of Black education, during the time period that he's living through. But he's also, aware that there's a much longer history that precedes his own efforts, where we see white philanthropists facilitating dysfunction in the world of Black education. We think about the Du Bois versus Booker T. Washington debate, right? That's a misnaming. That in reality, that debate that we often refer to is actually the story of white philanthropists kind of creating and facilitating this kind of dysfunction in the world of Black education because of their competing ideologies. And we tend to think of Du Bois and Washington as the kind of representatives of this, but that's troubling for me because it actually masks the role of private white capital in undermining the efforts of Black educators on the ground and in communities.
Oh my God, that just seems so familiar. It's still happening. I see it is still happening. Anyway, I have a question from Joy Lindsay, who says, thank you, Dr. Givens, for your work. In your book, we see that Woodson and others taught outside of public schools, for example, in Sunday school classes and in the homes of friends, family, and coworkers. Would you consider teaching in these spaces to be practices of fugitive pedagogy? And I'm wondering if there were any learning spaces where the art of Black teaching was free of covert acts and white surveillance.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And that allows me to kind of open up and share that what I'm conceptualizing as fugitive pedagogy is not only about these kind of grand moments of subversion. It's not only about the secret reading from the textbook. That's one of the kind of physical manifestations and performances of it. But I would say that what I'm naming as fugitive pedagogy is also a part of the kind of intellectual labor that Black people are doing to try to think outside of the confines of dominant scripts of knowledge. Literally the writing of these textbooks and the creation of a kind of counter intellectual tradition and an alternative intellectual tradition is also a part of that fugitive pedagogy. And this is absolutely work that goes back to the work that Black people are doing in informal educational spaces. And this is a part of Woodson's own narrative, right? When Woodson is a teenager, before he even starts high school, he doesn't start high school until he's 20 years old. But one of the things that he writes about as very formative for his own education experience is when he's working in the coal mines of West Virginia. He's a kind of a young student, a young boy at the time, but he's working alongside all of these grown men who are former Civil War veterans. They're Civil War veterans and formerly enslaved Black people. Most of them are illiterate. They would ask him to read to them in the evenings in the parlor of one of their homes, and they would purchase books that were published by Black authors. They would buy Black newspapers. They would also buy the kind of mainstream newspapers as well and ask for him to read to them. And that allowed them to interact with the written word, even as they themselves couldn't decipher words on the page, right? But one of the things that Woodson says is that he also learned from them about their experiences, right? You know, they had alternative perspectives about what happened during the Civil War that might have told a different story than what was presented in newspapers, right? Or any of the kind of other dominant texts that they would have been reading. And so what Woodson is seeing is this way that Black people have been kind of speaking back to dominant scripts and to kind of official knowledge. And that is a part of fugitive pedagogy, right? That becomes the substance and the background and the intimate knowledge that he brings with him when he goes to a place like Harvard University and he has his professors tell him that there is no such thing as Black history, or Black people have no history and culture, or at least none worthy of respect, right? When Woodson hears those things, he has these alternative kind of bodies of knowledge that he's exposed to from the communities that he came from the stories he heard from his mother, who talked about being sold in a coffle of slaves while standing in front of the statue of George Washington in Richmond, Virginia, right? So Woodson has these images of the way that Black people's experience, speaks back and opens up different ways of thinking about the history of the United States from their distinct position. That is a part of this fugitive pedagogical tradition, right? It's about this counter knowledge that also becomes expressed in the resistance and the subversive physical acts, the hiding of textbooks, the kind of performance of compliance to white authorities, even as they have different political motivations for what it is that they're doing with education, but they can't speak freely because they know that they would either be fired if they're seen as being too uppity, right, or too radical, as many Black teachers were often accused of being.
Okay, how are you doing? We still have some more questions if you have energy to answer them. So we'll keep going a little bit longer. We're supposed to wind up at 7:30, but here's another question from Ismael Jimenez. What is the role of fugitive pedagogy in relation to contemporary clandestine and explicit manifestations of white supremacy / racism? Can the idea of fugitive pedagogy exist as theory of teaching practice that can be transferable?
So I wasn't sure if that question was referring to whether or not fugitive pedagogy also maps on to the subversive kind of networks and work and efforts of kind of white supremacist teaching. What I would say is that the language for me is not just to be kind of extracted as in a metaphorical sense. The language for me is talking about an intellectual and educational politics that extends from the experiences of enslaved people who were engaging first in the practices of fugitive literacy. Literally, the language of fugitive is talking about the fact that Black education is criminalized because of anti-literacy laws that make literacy and certain gatherings of Black people without white surveillance illegal. So that's where the kind of language extends from. But what I would say is that, yes, it is, and I see that that there's a clarification. So it's talking about transferable in a positive way. And I'm assuming positive means for people that are trying to challenge white supremacy in schools in the contemporary moment. And I would say that this tradition of fugitive pedagogy is something that has continued to be embodied in a number of teachers who have always kind of worked to teach against the grain, and particularly as it relates to accounting for the material experiences of Black people, right? I would say is an extension of this tradition. I've had Black educators in my life as well when I was growing up and attending predominantly Black schools with all Black teachers. I often seen my teachers engage in practices that were challenging, the kind of dominant scripts of knowledge, and that were helping us to kind of place ourselves and our educational experiences in relationship to a much longer history. They did not place it explicitly in relationship to the history that I'm writing about in my book, because to be honest, many of the teachers that I had who were operating in this tradition were not aware of this history because of the kind of rupture that happened with the undermining of Black educators in the post-Brown era with the rolling out of desegregation. nonetheless, Black people have continued to kind of seek out alternative forms of education and meaningful education, which in many ways kind of reflects the spirit of fugitive pedagogy, even if it's not explicit in the way that, or coordinated in the way that we see with these kind of institutions that Black educators had, that they developed over the course of a century leading up and through the Brown period. But that really kind of becomes gutted in the 1960s. But absolutely, the kind of spirit of what I'm writing about manifests in individual teachers and kind of groups of teachers, even as I will be clear to say that it's nowhere near on the scale and scope of what we actually see with this kind of legacy of teachers that I'm writing about in the book, because of the kind of institutions and the kind of intentional networks that were created that sustained this practice over the course of generations.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I have a question from Edith Bazil. Given that we have a majority white teaching force who primarily lack awareness and knowledge of this important history, what is the most effective way to get teacher prep programs, school districts, school leaders, and policymakers to study this book so they have accurate knowledge about the impact of Black educators and the educational excellence they provided, particularly with regard to decolonizing the curriculum?
Thank you for that question. And Edith, it's so good to hear from you. I haven't seen you in a while. When I first got here, it was great to kind of meet with Edith Bazil when she was the president of the Black Educators Alliance of Massachusetts. But thank you for that question. One of the things that I would say is that I'm always going to say that there's a need for more Black teachers, and that is a first priority when it comes to this kind of question. The lack of diversity in the teaching profession will continue to kind of exacerbate the issues that we see in schools. And so that always has to be kind of a first priority when it comes to this particular set of concerns. But I would also say that absolutely, teacher training programs need to recognize that there is, well, one, that there needs to be a lot of work done to kind of bolster and kind of rethink the kind of intellectual training that teachers have and the intellectual experiences that teachers have access to in their training programs, and that it has to be about more than just the kind of procedural aspects of what happens in the class. Teachers also need to be given space to kind of think and engage in the kind of reflexive work of understanding who they are in relationship to the history of education as a social institution in our society, but also to be exposed to the various traditions of teaching that have kind of come before them, right? History is rarely kind of taught in a serious way in the context of teacher training programs. And I think that history is important, not just for social studies or history teachers, but I think all educators need to be given time to reflect on the kind of the historical context that many of the contemporary problems that we have emerge from, and that they need to be able to kind of think across those experiences. And that they also need to realize that there's a lot that they can learn from traditions of kind of non-dominant educators, and particularly Black teachers, who were a kind of a group of educators who were kind of fiercely persecuted, right? But who developed an educational tradition that inspired generations of Black leaders, right? If these are educators who look to people like John Lewis and Angela Davis and Martin Luther King and Sonia Sanchez, and they celebrate them for all the wonderful and important things that they did, you know, and saying that they're interested in exposing that tradition to students, they also need to realize that those leaders are products of the social emotional context that was cultivated in the educational spaces that they came from, right? Where those leadership qualities, where those kind of political aspirations were stimulated. We can't understand someone like John Lewis or Martin Luther King Jr. or Angela Davis in isolation from this tradition. They didn't just fall out of the sky, or they didn't just become important and kind of charismatic and thoughtful leaders when they got to, you know, Boston College or Brandeis University when Angela Davis went there for school. But they also were coming from a tradition that they were enacting in the world, right? And so contemporary educators can study and learn from this tradition as well. The other part about this question about decolonization is that I think that we have to be careful about the language that we use. Not careful to say that it's not important to use the language of decolonization, But one of the critiques that a lot of, particularly indigenous scholars, for instance, when it comes to the language of decolonization have offered is that there can often be a way that, educators and school systems can become invested in talking about decolonizing knowledge. But, there's a very important article called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor, right? Is that the work that has to be done in schools must also be tied to larger kind of transformative reforms in society that has to do with the real material suffering that communities of color have been experiencing across generations, right? So such that the work that's happening in school must always be attached to broader kind of efforts for kind of political struggle and social transformation. That is also something that's embodied by these teachers, is that their agenda was not just about state standards of education, right? They created an agenda that took into account the educational and the developmental needs of students, but also took into account the political and the material needs of students based on the kind of racial stratification of society that that impacted their lives as students and as people in the world, right? So that language of decolonizing curriculum, right, is a very thin commitment if it's not also attached to broader kind of structural changes in the society that we live in. And teachers have to understand their work as always tied to both of those things.
You're here. I have a question from Kay who asks, do we see examples of Black fugitive education today? What forms does it take, if so? And is it informed by intersectional dynamics, which have become so important today?
Well, I would say that even these teachers that I'm right, Black teachers' practices had always been informed by intersectional practices, especially when we account for the fact that the majority of Black teachers were African-American women. So, while, Woodson is the kind of key figure in my book, I was also intentional to open with the story of Tessie McGee because she was in many ways representative of the majority of Black teachers during the time period, because more than at least three-quarters of Black teachers by that time period would have been African-American women. And so I should say that a lot of my kind of conceptualization of fugitive pedagogy and how Black educators are navigating power actually is borrowing from the work of a number of Black women historians who have written about how Black women have navigated power in society in these kind of covert ways, right? The ways that they've worked to kind of undermine the kind of authoritative power imposed on their lives. So this theory is very much so an outgrowth of a lot of those ideas. But I would say that, in the contemporary moment, a lot of that has become even more kind of explicit as we've inherited more scholarship from Black feminist studies and folks who have written about, the history of Black women, the history of gender, the history of sexuality, right? And all of these things, we have these kind of being brought into the tradition of thinking about Black life and experiences in intersectional ways. And I would absolutely say that that's become more explicit by kind of, by some Black educators. There's absolutely more work that can be done there. So yeah, that's, there are absolutely ways in which that intersectional approach has become more explicit today, but it's also still present in the historical context when we look at it. When we look at the work of people like Anna Julia Cooper and Mary McLeod Bethune and Nannie Helen Burroughs, who are very explicit in terms of the thing, they're thinking about, the education of Black women, right? And how that is a very distinct, how that raises a very distinct set of questions, obviously that being informed by their own lived experiences. And so this is one of the things that we see happening, is that Black teachers have always been kind of intensely aware of their kind of their subjugation in the world, both because of their race, but in terms of Black women, also because of their gender, and because of their hyper awareness of this, because they, in fact, they lived in a Jim Crow society that kind of policed their bodies with white, colored signs and white signs that told them where they could go, where they could not go. That hyper awareness of their bodies absolutely informed their thinking and their practices as teachers. So even when it wasn't named explicitly, it's absolutely there in shaping the work that they're doing in the context of schools. And that's also something that is important for teachers to also study as well, right? This language of, we have a language of intersectionality, but the kind of practice of it when it comes to pedagogy is not something that is new and that only emerges after kind of Black studies scholars have, gave us that language. It's something that's embodied in practice as well for quite some time when we look at the history of Black educators.
I think we have time for, I'm going to read one comment. I don't think there's a question in it, but I wanted to share it. And a final question, and then we'll wrap up. So the comment comes from Darnell Williams, who says, Dr. Givens, thank you for such a thought-provoking and incredibly liberating and affirming lecture. I echo what others have already stated. This should be required reading, especially in teacher preparation programs, in-service professional development workshops, high school reading lists, etc. I'm interested in getting this book, the link's in the chat, and the movement of fugitive pedagogy into our schools to promote the subversive resistance and liberatory education that is so very needed in classrooms and schools today. And then this will be the last question from Wesley. Really enjoyed the three-pronged framework of looking at teacher, text, and student. Does the disciplinary burden placed upon students of color, for example, the violence upon and policing of young Black bodies, in particular, offer an obstacle to fugitive pedagogy that you'd be able to speak on for a bit? Any ways for educators to combat the unique fugitivity faced systematically by young people?
Thank you for that question. I'm going to understand that question to be asking an invitation for me to talk about why this history is important for thinking about students in the current moment. Is that the same sense of what you have, Lisa? Okay, so one of the things that I think is important is, while this book is about the kind of the work of teachers historically, the last chapter of the book, I ended the last chapter in the book is about students and placing students squarely in this narrative as not just witnesses, but talking about how, as they're witnessing the work of their teachers, how they're also participating in this tradition. And for me, that was instructive and important to do that, because I think that this is important not just for educators to help put their work into perspective, but I also think that learning this information in this history is very, very important for Black students to have a different frame and a different way of thinking about not just what's at stake in their education, but also a kind of alternative heritage and educational tradition that they also have to look to, that they can kind of draw on, and not just to inspire themselves, to be inspired by, but also to analyze the kind of ongoing kind of alienation that Black people experience in schools, right? I think that this is a history that also needs to be introduced to Black students earlier on. I think schools do a terrible job in general helping students understand the larger aims of education beyond going to school to be working buyers and buying workers, right? Other than the kind of, what job are you going to get? What profession are you going to move into, other than the demands of the labor market, right? This history is the story about Black people centering their kind of human striving in education, right? And I think that this is something that Black students can also benefit from engaging with, because it can help them kind of look at education with a new lens, right? And to kind of inherit this kind of much longer set of politics and perspective about education and Black life than what's offered to them implicitly through the education that they're receiving. Because there's a lack of political clarity that Black students have, and I think that undermines anything that can be done towards liberatory education in the context of schools, if students are not able to kind of situate themselves on this much longer continuum of the struggle for education and justice, right? And it's beyond just the Brown v. Board of Education, because that story does not give students access to this much longer, rich kind of narrative about Black people's collective struggle for human dignity, right, through the pursuit of education, and what that means for their own lives in the contemporary moment. This is a history that's trying to offer a new frame to talk about what's at stake in education for Black people, but I think it also has it raises universal questions about what the deeper meanings of education and society are beyond the demands of kind of capital and beyond the demands of the labor market and the demands of the marketplace, right? And because I think a lot of that, the lack of political clarity around those things has done a lot of damage to the kind of spiritual experience that should be at the center of education. And I'm not talking about the spiritual experience in terms of any particular kind of religious orientation to that. You know, there are different ways of thinking about it, but really the kind of humanistic aspect of education that really gets stifled out and stripped out, both with the deprofessionalization of teachers that limit how teachers themselves get to show up and be present in schools and as thinkers and as producers of knowledge, right? But that also carries on down to the alienation of students as well, who are positioned in schools in ways that that kind of maim their own humanity, right? And that doesn't allow for their full selves to kind of come and be present. So I think that this history is a way to open up a new way of thinking about all of those things.
Yeah, you're really speaking to my heart with those last comments about, you know, we often go out and give talks, and I always ask, what is school for? It's for so much more. It's for developing participants in democracy and all the things that you talk about, and it has been so narrowed by a lot of the policies that we're fighting against. So again, I just have to express my profound appreciation to you for this wonderful talk and your generosity in sharing your knowledge. And I know I'm really looking forward to reading the whole book and other people as well. And I would be remiss if I didn't. I also want to thank Barbara Fields for all the work she did, and Lou Kruger from the CPS board, who also worked with us on preparing this and the rest of the series. So this was part one of what we hope will be a 3-part series, but part 2 is scheduled for Saturday, October 16th at 11 a.m., also by Zoom, with Dr. Teresa Perry, who will present on looking back to look forward toward the theory and practice of achievement for African-American students. Dr. Perry is a professor emerita in the Africana Studies and Education departments at Simmons University, and I've been sending out information about that. I'll send out more. We'll send out the video. And
Lisa,
yes.
I'd like to just make a closing thank you as well to Dr. Givens. And I know that in his last chapter of the book, he makes an appeal for a renewed conversation between the field of Black studies and Black teachers, as well as other practitioners. And I just want to thank him for working sort of in the tradition of Dr. Woodson in his work as an expert in that field with Black teachers, and particularly the organization that we're a part of. And he's there, and we're just learning so much from him. And I just want to thank you for that. And as you were saying, Lisa, around his book, just encouraging people to get the book and to get it through our Frugal Bookstore. And you have the link to that in the chat. And we thank you for even giving us 5 minutes more than we said we were going to take from you, but it's certainly been an exciting, informative experience for us. And with that, Lisa, I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks, Barbara. And thanks to everyone who came and the people who stuck it out to the end, and all the wonderful questions and comments that people shared in the chat. And I'm looking forward to continuing this dialogue, Dr. Givens, and also continuing our series. Perhaps Dr. Givens will come to part 2 and participate.
Teresa is my neighbor, so we talk about these things all the time. So I definitely will be in the audience when she's giving her presentation. Thanks so much for the invitation and for bringing me here, and for the wonderful engagement from the audience as well. I appreciate the questions.
Okay. All right. Thanks, everyone, and good night.
Good night.
Yeah. Bye-bye.